Beyond the Mic with Sean Dillon.
We're joined on the star line by Jake Brown, author of over 50 books over the last 20 years. He's covered interviews with record producers and much more. His 50th book is Behind the Boards, Nashville. We welcome Jake Brown.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Let's go beyond the mic, Jake. Do you remember the first album that you ever got, and which song did you play to death?
Oh, that would be Beat It on Michael Jackson's Thriller. No question. Had a babysitter who left her records at our house because her parents were like super Christian or whatever. And so I had Shout at the Devil, 8 years old. I had like Shout at the Devil by Motley Crue, Van Halen, 1984, Prince, Purple Rain, and just some sort of seminal 80s records that, also being raised as an 80s baby at the MTV era, 5 to 15. I mean, I saw music was just all around me. Also seeing live concerts back then for $20, in junior high and up, you could, go and see, for $20 on a Friday night, you could go see anybody. It was just an amazing time to absorb music. But I started young, definitely, with Michael Jackson and then Eddie Van Halen out of that song. Became a huge Van Halen fan. And then there's some others, but those were kind of the first two huge impression bands on me. 1984 to me was like 2001 as a movie was to some people.
Now, how did your parents encourage your love of music?
One of the reasons I think I'm good at writing the types of book I do is that because I relate directly to the people as a musician of 7 instruments. I'm a by-ear player. I started out on piano at 5 or 6 and then went to drums and bass and guitar and beyond. And so my parents, Jim and Tina Brown, extraordinarily supportive. My mother's a painter, got 2 master's degrees from WashU while I was growing up. So there was also a little record store called Vintage Vinyl. From about 4th grade on, I could ride my bike across that campus. It was safer back then. It was a different time, and go to that store and I could pick up cutouts and I'd bring them home of every different variety of band. And you had Casey's Top 40. So they encouraged me, I think MTV in the organic sense that back then you were playing the instrument and going, look, Mom, look at this song. And then, hey, can I go see that concert? You know what I mean? And I used it as a bargaining chip as much as possible. And then when I got old enough to go to mosh pit shows, back then 930 Club in D.C. where I went to high school and in St. Louis Riverfront down there, Mississippi Nights, you could go see a band and kind of get exposed to the live side of what these songs did to people. Beastie Boys and all the 1990s in high school I had with Lollapaloozas and other things. So it was just an amazing time to grow up. And I write about it and with a lot of those groups today.
What instrument were you the best at? What instrument were you the worst at growing up?
Well, I was a piano player from about 6 on. I had a wonderful teacher named Mr. Robinson. I studied at a classical music conservatory in high school for piano, and I was their only by-ear player. Valerie Kamaikom was my instructor. And then I started playing drums. My papa, Armin Themi, rest in peace, gave me my first drum set. He was a clown after he retired, and he had a kick drum and a bass drum, like a floor tom. So in 6th or 7th grade in the basement, I started kind of banging on those, and so that evolved into a full set. I always played bass growing up because it was sort of easy and around, and you could play bass on someone else's guitar. And I moved out to LA after college and got into a band out there, but I was also making demos, like kind of my own, playing everything in college. And so just even, that's what I mean. I don't in any way want to compare it to the guys that I write with because of where their success levels are, but I organically know what like a 4-track is. Bouncing 3 tracks down to the 4, so you have another 3 that are free and things like that. And just back when it was analog. And in this book, there's amazing journeys of people who came here, like, Tony Brown was Elvis Presley's, last piano player. Norbert Putnam was his bass player. And they started out in the session world. Paul Worley, Dan Huff, James Stroud is a drummer. And then these guys learned producing organically from the other side of the board. And then when they got over to that side of the board, they were able to communicate with these session bands and other players, the artists. They were the stars they produced because they'd been musicians. I definitely am a little bit more able to talk their language and kind of get nerdy about certain things because I understand how those sides of the business work, I guess, and musically how, kind of that whole side of the thing that mind works. And
where did you get the inspiration for the Nashville edition of Behind the Boards?
That's an interesting question. I had done a series. I had the Joe Satriani Strange Beautiful Music memoir come out in 2014, and that was an enormously successful book. It's for me, very lucky as an author. And it kind of gave me carte blanche on my next book to that same publisher, and I had already sold them on Nashville Songwriter, which was the first sort of seed to do this book. And basically, Nashville Songwriter was the first book series of its kind. It focuses on the songwriters it's kind of the unsung heroes of country music, along with the producers. A lot of the stars that you have all these huge hits by are actually written by these songwriters. It's an incredible machine, but it's a very human, down-to-earth, down-home. The houses that these people write in are literal houses on streets called Music Row in a lot of cases. So it was a really special kind of different. I'd never, ever written a book like that where the backdrop of writing it was so different from your typical recording studios and things like that. It gave me a real, because the first 10 years I lived here, I was a rock writer and hip hop writer. So I didn't really interface with country. And at the time I then started to do it, I was at enough of a level where I could get access to a lot of these people. And they just proved to be the most down-to-earth people in the world. So that led me to meet some of the people that wound up in this book, like Shane McNally and Chris DiStefano and Luke Laird and Ross Copperman. And then my dog died in 2018. Rest in peace, Hanover, my Cocker Spaniel. And my wife and I were devastated, and I needed something to pull me out of a really serious depression. And I thought, why not relaunch the Behind the Boards series, but do a country producer? Then, Dave Cobb was the first guy to sign on. And Dave Cobb is like a hero of mine modernly. He's amazing. He's like the Rick Rubin of his generation. This Chris Stapleton and Shooter Jennings and Jason Isbell and Sturgill Simpson and the song The Star Is Born soundtracks in this book. So that kind of led to, once the word of mouth got going, Dan Huff signed up, and I already had Jesse Frazier and Zach Crowell from the National Songwriter Series, and those guys do Sam Hunt and Thomas Rhett. And I tell you the ones, though, that were a little bit harder work, to be honest. Jim Ed Norman, who, of course, did Born to Boogie by Hank Williams Jr. and others, he really doesn't like doing interviews, and I had to get some help from other producers to get some of these guys. Buddy Cannon, Paul Worley was a great asset to me. But, you started expanding it, and it just spirals outward, and word of mouth gets out, and then I had late editions. I mean, I was interviewing Tony Brown, who's George Strait's producer, in February of this year, right before the COVID shutdown. Frank Rogers, Brad Paisley's longtime producer, Buddy Cannon, and others. So my point is that it just became a 2-year kind of, it wasn't a marathon, but I mean, some of these conversations, some of these chapters are 45 pages long. And so I talked to these guys. I talked to Dave Cobb 2 or 3 times over several years. Michael Knox, Jason Aldean's producer, and I spent comprehensive time. Great example, Taylor Swift's producer, Nathan Chapman. We sat there and went word by word and line by line to get it exactly how he wanted it. And that was important to me, too, that all of the 30 producers in this book, for the most part, were either given the opportunity, and most read and approved their chapters in advance and gave me input and tweaked them. And so we really feel like it's their story as well as the story behind their, the greatest hits they produced for these country stars.
Producers stay behind the scenes. They make the magic. They're probably one of the most important people that you don't really get to see. How difficult was it to get these producers to open it up? And was it easier with each opportunity you had to talk with them?
To be honest, not that challenging. For the most part, Shane McNally had some demands on his time, understandably. So my access to him was a little bit more kind of, this is the conversation. And then I did a follow-up by phone with him as well. I talked to Tony Brown several times. I talked to Michael Knox several times. I talked to Byron Gallimore for about 3 hours. We just did that in one shot. James Stroud and I talked for about 3 hours, broken up over 2. And the deal I made with all of these amazing guys is that I was going to give them as much time as they wanted to tell their entire story and talk about specifics in particular. A lot of it took the time it took because these guys, in some cases, common threads throughout the book have been with these stars since the beginning to now, 25 years. Casey Tim McGraw and Byron Gallimore, 15 years, Michael Knox and Jason Aldean, Tony Brown, and George Strait were together for 22 plus. But my point is, it took all of that time to go through that catalog. Luke Bryan, Jeff and Jody Stevens, we went song by song. So if you're a country fan, it's 300 number ones in this book. Once you get these guys talking, I mean, they like to talk shop, and I think, to be fair, a lot of producers don't get the credit they deserve. And so I think, the concept that if they're signing up to kind of go in depth and they kind of want to talk shop anyway, and you can weave the human story within that of the struggle, because that's the other side of it. I wanted to tell them, I said, look, this isn't like fluff. I don't want one page on your background. I want to know your struggles and how long it took you to get here and get your first hit or get your first gig as a session player, or, how you got fired and your wife and kids were, months from eviction. And then Jeff Stevens became a songwriter that way. I mean, after years of kind of getting a record deal and having to go nowhere. And Paul Worley was a session player for years. So there's just some really amazing stories of perseverance and inspirational stories of that, because there isn't a producer in this book that it came easy to. Shane McNally came here in 2000 and had a solo album that flopped. I mean, Ross Copperman and Jimmy Robbins, who are both in this book, were artists. Ray Riddle, who was Big Smo, country rapper's producer and DJ for years. I mean, it took 10 years for them to get the Country Livin' and the Warner deal. I mean, so there's a lot of different examples of that where you have these sort of long-term investments that these producers made. And I think it makes them proud to be able to reflect back on it. So we didn't have too much trouble.
Jake Brown is author of Behind the Boards Nashville, and he joins us beyond the mic. Which one of these stories is your favorite one of the book?
Well, I'll tell you, my favorite story of the entire book involves Tony Brown and the How Do I Live from Con Air. He was at like 11 o'clock at night on a Sunday night after being out in L.A. for something else, brought over to Jerry Bruckheimer's office. And Jerry Bruckheimer said, look, I've got one version of this song that Leanne Rimes did for one part, or the front of the movie. I want another for the final scene. And he showed him like the whole dailies, you know, of the plane crash on Las Vegas Strip and everything. And he said, I need it in 2 days.
2 days?
Oh, yeah. And Tony Brown looked at him like, okay. And he said, yeah. He said, 2 days. So Tony Brown flew back on a red eye, and he got Trisha Yearwood in the studio the next day with the band. And that just shows you how professional these bands are here, too. Amazing. Best session players in the world. Best songwriters in the world that live in Nashville. Best record producers in a lot of cases. Anyway. Or among them. They get everything done. Jerry Bruckheimer has like a setup where he can sit in his office and listen to the session live. So he can almost be there at the console. Talk about being behind the boards with Tony. And they basically knocked this song out. And then Dan Huff's father, came in and did strings the next day. And they delivered it in 48 hours. And then it wound up becoming a competitive single. It was one of the first times and only times, because there's a history in country music of songs getting re-recorded over the generations. But this was one of the only times, at the same time, there were two versions of How Do I Live that were battling on the charts. And both wound up, getting nominated for Grammys and winning different categories at the the Country Awards. And so it was just a really funny sort of example of also how professional you have to be able to pull that off. Frank Rogers, Brad Paisley's longtime producer, Darius Rucker from Hootie and the Blowfish. They were making Darius's first country record. He comes in and, in an afternoon, they knock out, 3 or 4, finished songs, and 3 of them became number one. And Frank said Darius was sitting there looking at him at the end of it going, man, in Hootie, we'd just be getting drum sounds. And yeah, you guys are so on it that you're like knocking these out in an afternoon. So just the rapidity, the huge, the fast speed at which these guys have to move.
Over the last 50 books, what was the biggest challenge in getting people to talk to you?
I got lucky in that regard because I started with the Producers series, and I had this very fortunate thing with Tupac Shakur's estate authorizing a Tupac in the Studio, which is another series I write. That led to Heart in the Studio, which I wrote with Ann and Nancy Wilson, and then Motorhead in the Studio, which I wrote with Lemmy Kilmister, rest in peace. So that series has like everyone from Rick Rubin to Dr. Dre to Tori Amos in it, Tom Waits, AC/DC, Iron Maiden. That was sort of gave me a name as a writer of behind the scenes, kind of how records are made. And fortunately also because there's an academic slant to this series, and SAE and a lot of most of the music schools thankfully have at least a couple of my books in their libraries because they're just a technical reference. And that was the case with Rick Rubin and Behind the Boards actually for SAE here locally. But that led to Joe Satriani. I went and found his manager's email and hit him up, and I wanted to write it in the studio book with him. And instead, it turned into this amazing musical memoir that had stories behind how all of his records are made and how he comes up with all of his otherworldly solos from Surfing with the Alien On and In It Summer Song and etc. So it just kind of, that answer isn't like I didn't like camp outside their tour buses. If you do this long enough and I feel like one proud thing I've got is a thread that weaves throughout my whole catalog is I never use an anonymous source. I've always endeavored to make sure that the people that I do interview take up the majority of the time that they're on the page, and that what we talk about is of importance to them in the sense of like, I'm not going to ask about, like Jane's Addiction. We did a Beyond the Beats of Rock Drummers series. I do the first book that had 12 drummers, and one of them was Jane's Addiction's drummer, Steve Perkins. And we spent 20 minutes talking about this very famous song of theirs called 3 Days and how it was constructed. And it was amazing to me that he wanted to talk for 20 minutes about that song, because I love that song. And I know everyone that read it liked it because they just did such an amazing performance. But that's what I mean. If you let a drummer talk for 20 minutes about one song, they tend to trust you that you're going to let them kind of tell their full story. And that book had the drummers from Motley Crue, Metallica, Aerosmith, Journey, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Bon Jovi, Red Hot Chili Peppers. I'm just trying to cover them. Foo Fighters. It was such an amazing collection. And Volume 2, which comes out in a couple of years, has 30 more of them. The Police, Clash, Iron Maiden, all down the line. So I just try to really let them know that they're going to be able to tell their full story. And that usually kind of opens the gate. There's a Joey Kramer Aerosmith interview. So he was in that book as well. That's the name I was trying to vent, and Taylor Hawkins from the Foo Fighters. But when I was talking to, when I got the word that Joey Kramer was going to do it, I thought, wow, that's a real honor, because I grew up trying to play Aerosmith records and, love them and love Aerosmith, and like everybody does. And so when we start talking, I'm all excited. He's like, yeah, man, ask me whatever you want, and so we start talking about beats, and we go through Walk This Way, and we go through Back in the Saddle, and we go through, 5 or 6 of their, thankfully I asked about, the rule of thumb if you're interviewing and you're new to it, always ask about the sort of bigger hits first, because some of these guys run out of steam. Some love to talk for hours, but some run out of steam and don't like to talk about it. So we get about 7 beats in, and I'm like, oh, that's so cool. And that part that dropped out when you went down with the toms, and you were talking about Back in the Saddle, and we got to him, and he goes, hey, Jake, man, enough about the songs. And I was like, I'm sorry, excuse me, because I didn't understand what he had said at first, And he goes, enough about the songs, man. I think we've covered the songs. And I was like, oh, okay. It was a kind of a pivot that was unusual, because most people want to talk about that. But that gives you another example. If you're going to be writing books, or you're going to be writing songs, you have to come with a lot of ideas. You have to be able to have a lot of questions ready. So we still had to make up 50 more minutes. That was like an hour one. Sometimes you get the opposite. I don't get that very often. That was a kind of a one-off, because it was Joey Kramer. So you're not going to say, well, all right, well, thank you for your time. So then we shifted into talking about playing live, and, kind of improvised it. Yeah, I mean, it's, and Jay Maskis from Dinosaur Jr. was in one of the first Behind the Boards books. He's a real buttoned up kind of, you really have to kind of pull, a little to get him to open up. And then once he does, he'll talk for a long time. But anyway, so if Billy Corgan was one that I worked pretty hard to get from Smashing Pumpkins to do a tape up story with me. I had to really promise him we weren't going to turn it into a book, or try to, And then he opened up and talked about all of his records and how he made them. It was amazing. It's just there's different ways to approach different artists, that depending on what you're kind of, also it's sometimes you're talking to them about someone else's book. So it's easier for them to talk because they're not talking about themselves.
I remember editing tape and audio with razor blade and tape in the old days of radio.
Analog.
Good old analog. How has that change made producing better or worse with technology?
That's a very interesting question, and I've answered that twice today. And my answers have kind of evolved with each. So I have the best answer for you, because this is the one I was looking. I love these other ones, but I was looking really forward to this show. So any producer that was going to fight the inevitable of having to format over to digital, where you have virtual tracks, it changed, it revolutionized recording. And, the upside of it is that it made it easier and quicker. The downside of it is that there's a generation of kids that have grown up using samples that are really great, that come from someone else that actually recorded that. And so as an example, in this book, we try to really go into detail without being too nerdy, to where if you want to know what your reference points for, how did that get that Tim McGraw sound on that drum kit? Well, what does Byron Gallimore use on it? Well, I like an RE20 on the kick drum. Dave Cobb can tell you about a certain room sound and the old school techniques he still goes by. So the mix today is a hybrid. Dave Cobb is a great example of that. He's extraordinarily talented at it, because he'll take one mic and record a Grammy-winning record. A lot of it's in the ears of the producer, but it also is a definite balance. Don't try to work in the record business today if you don't know how to use Logic or Pro Tools, period. Producers really today need to be able to play an instrument, even if it's just, a few chords on a guitar, because it makes it. A lot of the guys in this book started out as session players, so they were from the other side of the glass learning how good producers, and they'll say not so good producers, worked, and who they could understand. The more times than not, they were musicians themselves. The musical side of it, but also it's a hybrid. Jeff and Jody Stevens that produced Luke Bryan, that's a father-son team, and Jody came from hip-hop, and it blended beautifully. But you also have track guys, and we've got pretty much all the top track guys in this book: Chris Stefano, Luke Laird, Zach Crowell, Ray Riddle. There's a bunch of them, and they all adhere to that same thing, where they can walk into a writing session with a demo they put together. Chris Stefano did that with Carrie Underwood in one case, and what you hear on the radio is pretty much his demo. So, and they do the whole song. Joey Moy with Florida Georgia Line, where they'll build out the entire drums, the bass, the guitar. They play all the instruments themselves, and then just say bring in a fiddle player or a dobro player. That's an extraordinarily talented group of people. Ross Copperman and others that are doing that. Jesse Frazier, Jimmy Robbins fit in that club, and others. mix, I guess, is the hybrid. The smart producers that stay hanging around, especially the ones in this book that have worked, say, for 25 years with the same artist, like a Byron Gallimore, Tim McGraw, or a Kenny Chesney, Buddy Cannon, or a Tony Brown, George Strait, or whomever it was, Jeff Stevens, Luke Bryan. When that artist says, I want to head in a new direction, that producer's got to be able to adapt to it, too. You know what I mean? In order to survive. Clint Black's a real great example. We had the honor of having Clint Black in the book, and he produces all his own records. So sometimes these artists get so good at it, they become co-producers. And pretty much, most of the guys in this book told me, like, man, if this guy wants to be my co-producer and he's my boss, I'm pretty much going to just let him. I mean, but they actually turn out to be legitimate, producers, and they learn under these guys' wing and then become. Brad Paisley went out on his own after 15 years under learning with Frank Rogers. They had gone to college together. And then also another thing, Belmont University should deserve some credit. They had this amazing intern program in a studio where a lot of these guys, a fair number of them, and songwriters especially, went and they networked and were in classes. Brad Paisley and Frank Rogers were classmates. You get these stories. Tim McGraw and Byron Gallimore started out together when he was really, a nobody. I mean, hadn't made his name in the town yet, and so forth. So you really get the inspiring stories, too, of the trust and loyalty and the long-term connection. And that's the other thing within country that's so unique is that trust factor. Bear in mind, a guy like Michael Knox produces Jason Aldean. He listens to 2,000 songs between every record. George Strait's producer said they were listening to 3,000 songs to whittle it down to the 15 that the fans hear and the 30 or 50 that George picks from. So, I mean, think of the trust that an artist needs to place in that producer with his career to say, you pick the ones you think sound like, so Josh Leo, Alabama's producer, talks about throwing cassette tapes in the back of his car in the 80s. He'd be driving to and from sessions listening to song after song because that's how they recorded them back then. So, they really, you have to wear a lot of hats to answer your question. It's definitely a mix of a lot of things.
Jake Brown, author of Behind the Boards Nashville. We're going beyond the mic. You brought up Frank Rogers, who produced Brad Paisley's early work and being the first overdubber.
When him and Brad Paisley, and that's an interesting story because a lot of what you heard on that first record and a lot of part two, the fishing song, all of those big early hits, You Didn't Have to Be, and etc. Those were demos. Those were done, and a lot of times Frank was the guy who was sitting in there not only recording, but then adding guitar parts over top. And there's certain Brad Paisley songs, they escape me, where he had to go in and do overdubs even at the last minute just to get it right. He was an incredible guitar player. Paul Worley as well, and Dan Huff. These are some of the top historic guitar players, session players in town. So, you also kind of really get a really rich history of Nashville in this book. It talks about the studios that maybe aren't even here anymore. Talks about old nightclubs, and there's a really funny story from Ray Baker about Tootsie's. Tootsie's is a downtown Nashville, now very famous, world famous sort of tourist bar. Back in the day, it was where songwriters would come in between their Opry sets and stars, and hey, who are you recording Tuesday? And so would record, a song these guys had. And Tootsie would walk around with a hairpin at midnight and poke everyone in the butt of their jeans with her hairpin if they hadn't gotten up when she gave them the warning that they were closing at 12. And I mean, just little things like that. I still got a story, behind. I mean, just the funny humor and the camaraderie and the amazing organic way that a lot of these people made their way to the producer seats that they now sit in today.
You bring up Paul Worley. Another favorite from the book was Paul working with Martina McBride on Independence Day.
Yeah.
Having her sing the chorus a cappella before the band came even to play one note, one verse, one thing. She was singing it a cappella.
Yeah, well, and importantly, a guy like Paul in a song like that, that went on to become, that was a happy accident that actually went on to become a thing with the crowd where they would sing that to her or with her before she would start the song. And that was a controversial song. You think about the subject matter of that song, a woman that burns down, if you know the history of the song, it's got a kind of violent ending, and it was really, really a cutting edge thing. And that shows you the incredible A&R instinct that even a guy like Paul Worley, who's also a record label head, signed Big and Rich. He signed Lady Antebellum, now Lady A. He signed the band Perry, he signed the Dixie Chicks and produced them. Just the incredible amount of just like radar they have to constantly keep in the air for that kind of thing. And then also when they get into the studio and they're doing those warm-ups, there's so many lessons in this book about the record making process, and record the rehearsal is what you're getting at. And then also, if you have to do it 100 times, they do it 100 times, you know? And you mentioned tape editing, taping, you know, sort of the old way to do it. With Pro Tools, the upside is you can record more, but the downside is now you got to go through 100 takes when it might have been just 10, 20 years ago, you know, to get the perfect one. And then other kinds, people come in and they knock them out in the first one. You get amazing vocalists like Carrie Underwood and Miranda Lambert and Faith Hill and God, on and on, Casey Musgraves that just come in and sing it so good in the demo that demo is the keeper. Extraordinary town, extraordinary book. And this book's really a love letter to my hometown. I've lived here 18 years and met my wife here, and I'm really honored that the 50th book of whatever it could be, that it was a book about Nashville and specifically about record producers. It's definitely overdue, and I'm really glad that hopefully people enjoy it. They got to, you know, if you want to just stream along and listen to, just want to read about how a song was particularly recorded, like Live Like You Were Dying by, you know, Tim McGraw or whomever, that is a really cool interactive feature too. There's an ebook, there's an audiobook through Blackstone Audio that's 2 volumes. Physical book will be out in the next few weeks. So definitely you can get it any way you want to hear it.
Time's running out, so it's time for the Rocky Nate. 8 random questions. Answer with the first thing that comes to your mind.
Lightning round. Yeah.
There is no pressure. Favorite music to write to?
Prince.
Favorite movie of all time?
Oh, man. Heat. Robert De Niro, Al Pacino movie. Thank Robert, scene, coolest of ever.
Now, do you have a favorite comedian?
Oh, Bill Hicks and Eddie Murphy.
Okay. Who's your favorite Sopranos character?
Tony. Hands down.
Where was the best place you heard a concert? Who was the opening act?
Man, seen so many. 1980s, I saw the Rolling Stones at Busch Stadium. I was 13 with Tim Woolley. And Living Color was the opening group. And that was a trip.
What was the worst movie you've ever seen?
Worst movie? Firewalker, starring Chuck Norris and Lou Gossett Jr. First time my dad ever said to me and my brother on a Saturday, he used to take us to movies, all right, boys, let's go watch something else. And it was okay to leave a movie if you didn't like it because it was so bad. Oh, God, that was a bad movie.
What's your favorite dessert?
Raspberry sorbet ice cream, probably.
And what was your first thought when Lady Antebellum changed their name to Lady A?
I think it was a respectable thing to do, given probably the controversy that could consume an otherwise impeccable recording band. They're the future of country, the present of country. They're an amazing group, and I'm glad that they were both savvy and also respectful. And
Jake, where can people find more information about your books?
So you can go to Jake Brown Books, JakeBrownBooks.com, or Twitter, the same thing, Jake Brown Book. BehindTheBoardsNashville.com are all three. There's an Amazon Central page, but thankfully we've been fortunate with some of the coverage in the country media press. So there's also, you could Google the title, Behind the Boards Nashville, and get some really cool behind-the-scenes stories that were actually put out by American Songwriter Magazine or Parade or whomever. And also there's YouTube videos. There's over 100 YouTube videos with producers from the book, if you just want to sort of look at it that way. If you're not a reader, we still appreciate anyone that wants to check it out. And then, you can get it at Amazon or Audible. Or
his favorite movie is Heat. He writes listening to Prince. His 50th book, Behind the Boards, Nashville, is available at a retailer near you. Jake Brown, thanks for talking with me today.
Well, I'm honored to be on the show, and I appreciate it really greatly, and I hope you'll consider having me on again in the future, and thank you.
And that, my friends, is Beyond the Mic.